It's Veritas Forum with Dr. Craig Johnson, Professor in Residence of Chalcedon Christian Academy and Pastor of Bethel Christian Fellowship in Agora Hills.
Welcome to the Veritas Forum. My name is Craig Johnson. My guest, James Patrick Holding, president of Tecton Apologetics, a wonderful internet presence, and author of Shattering the Christ Myth. Welcome, JP.
Thank you, Craig.
We're going to talk about something that is so revolutionary, a Christian actually responding to the Christ myth thesis. What is the Christ myth?
The Christ myth thesis at its core simply says that Jesus did not exist. Now, not even as a person. Now, we're accustomed to critics of Christianity saying that Jesus wasn't the Son of God, did not rise from the dead. This goes even further. This gets rid of all the arguments against the resurrection of Jesus or against the salvation offered by Jesus by simply saying he didn't exist at all. He wasn't even a person on earth. So it's sort of like the latest fashionable shortcut for the critics of Christianity. Let's just make it easy and say he never even existed, and then we don't have to deal with the rest of that stuff.
So one fell swoop, right? The submarine just blows the bottom of the ship out. It used to be Lord, Liar, or Lunatic, the trilemma. Now it seems to be Lord, Liar, Lunatic, or Legend, where they're now realizing if we can deny there's a shred of evidence to support the historicity of Jesus, then of course Christianity is at best fraudulent or invented by later believers, and then those words and things are put back in the mouth of Jesus. So give us an idea of how prevalent the Christ myth is in our time.
Well, initially, some years ago, when it first started, the only person who was really theorizing it to any extent was a fellow named George Albert Wells, G.A. Wells, and he published about 6 or 7 books promulgating this idea of the Christ myth. Now, it's kind of ironic because within the last 4 years, G.A. Wells has decided that he no longer accepts the Christ myth. But in the meantime, more people have come up and decided that they want to stump for it. One of the leading proponents these days is a Canadian fellow named Earl Doherty, who only has a bachelor's degree in history, and he's written a book entitled The Jesus Puzzle. And he goes out on a limb for the Christ myth. These days, there's just a couple of other people out there. Most of the people who stump for this idea are self-published book authors. They publish private theories on it. It doesn't get out into the mainstream, although more recently now we're seeing a lot more mainstream expressions of the Christ myth. We're seeing things like Bill Maher's Religulous, which alluded to the Christ myth very briefly. We're seeing the film called Zeitgeist, which is online, which is very strongly advancing the Christ myth. And we're seeing more and more people on the internet publishing websites advocating the Christ myth. So the information is not being pushed out there by scholars or people who are authorities in history, but it is being pushed out there and being made aware of by more and more people.
Now, in your book, there is a reference to Sir Edward Durning Lawrence, who believed Francis Bacon had written the works of Shakespeare,
Yes,
called the Anti-Stratfordians. And the example is used that these people were considered to be such a fringe movement as to be dismissed for the curiosity that they were, that Shakespearean scholars wouldn't even address them because it might give them notoriety. What about the Christ mythers now? I mean, the mythicists, can we leave them alone? Can we just sit in a corner and hope that they'll sink?
Now, perhaps it used to be we could do that, and that is what most of the major historians will do with the Christ myth. A historian like Michael Grant, who is one of the great Greco-Roman historians of the modern times, dismissed it in barely a sentence. Another fellow named Ian Wilson dismissed it in barely a sentence. Professional historians had no patience for or no interest in the Christ myth as a theory. They thought it was absurd from the very beginning. We can't afford to be like that anymore. Grant and Wilson and these others were writing at a time before the internet, before it was easy for anyone to go out and publish or find material on things like the Christ myth. But now you can put in Jesus in something like Google, and a Christ myth page will come up in the very first page somewhere. That information will be exposed to everyone quickly and easily.
Now let's break down a definition of the Christ myth. You've given a broad definition. What are they advocating?
They are advocating simply that Jesus did not exist. Now, there are 2 basic forms to that, and we'll be talking more about those. One form of the theory is what I call the silence thesis, which is an advocacy that the New Testament itself indicates that Jesus did not exist as a person on earth. Generally speaking, the Gospels are dismissed as legendary records, and the letters of Paul are said to indicate a Jesus who is a spiritual being in heaven, not a man who walked the earth. The second version of the Christ myth, and these are not mutually exclusive, is what can be called the pagan copycat thesis. And that's the idea that the story of Jesus was stolen from stories of pagan gods who were also crucified, put in a tomb, rose from the dead, born of a virgin, what have you. And which is said of these gods depends on which god you're talking about, and we can talk about specifics another time on that.
So if someone runs into this idea, basically, how is it going to look? Someone's going to say there's not a shred of historical evidence that Jesus Christ ever existed. Then someone's going to say, well, what about the reliability of the four Gospels?
You know, what I've noticed about arguments like that, what these Christ mythers will do is they'll do something I call hurling the elephant. And when you come up with something like that, say, well, what about the Gospels? They'll throw something back to you that says, well, they're all late and legendary. And now all of a sudden, instead of having just one argument to deal with, which is Jesus didn't exist, you now have 5 arguments to deal with. Jesus didn't exist, and all 4 Gospels, 1, 2, 3, 4, are fake, are legendary, were not written by the people who wrote them. And so what they'll do is they'll pile these arguments on top of you. They'll throw the whole elephant at you, and you're left holding the elephant crushed underneath it. The average person already doesn't know how to answer the charge that Jesus didn't exist. How are they going to answer the charge now that the Gospels are not authentic? They're not ready for this kind of thing.
So they're going to say the reliability of the New Testament documents, they're unreliable, they're late, they're legends, they're later church reading their experience back into the mouth of Jesus, etc., etc. What are they going to say about other tenets of Christian doctrine?
Well, when
it's all invented, it's all after the fact.
Yeah, or it depends on the theory. The pagan copycat theory will say the ideas of salvation were stolen from the pagan gods. The silence theory will say that the salvation ideas are basically the same, but it's belief in a man who didn't exist on earth.
So, give us more on the silence dimension here.
Okay.
What is the silence dimension?
Okay, the silence dimension will look mainly at the letters of Paul and the other New Testament epistles, and they'll say, gee, Paul is not saying a whole lot about the life of Jesus. He doesn't mention things like he was born in Bethlehem, lived in Nazareth, doesn't mention Mary and Joseph. And so what they'll do is they'll say these lack of anchor points, earthly anchor points, indicates that Jesus lived in heaven somewhere, or in some spiritual realm, not on earth. The lack of details is the most critical part of the silence thesis.
So they can make a list, they didn't mention, of all the basics, and then say, therefore, now you make a very important point in Shattering the Christ Myth, talking about a high context society versus a low context society.
That's right.
Define those two, because I found that fascinating.
Okay. The difference between those two, a high context and low context society, can be summed up this way. In a high context society, people take a lot of information for granted. Whereas in a low context society, they tend to repeat information over and over, even if it is already known by other people. Now, generally, there are some societies that are high context, while others are low context. Modern Western nations are generally low context. The world of the Bible, the Greco-Roman world, was very high context. There are a lot of different reasons for that. Some of it has to do with the fact that being that they were 90% illiterate, they had to take a lot of information for granted. They had to use a lot of, we might say, code words, so that they could transfer information quickly without having to waste time on reading. Now, we're a low context society. We like to talk a lot. A member of a high context society would say of a person in a low context society, you talk too much and you don't say a lot. That's how they would put it. Now, we can imagine this, though, even in our own society, even though we're low context. We have higher context settings, even in our own low context society. You take your family, okay? You have a lot of inside jokes, probably. You have a lot of events that you've experienced together. You have some Thanksgiving dinner or something where Uncle George showed up pretending to be a pirate, and he had a lot of fun with that. And thereafter, you guys in your family might go to each other, "Arr, how you doing?" And everyone will remember that Thanksgiving dinner, everything that happened at that Thanksgiving dinner. Now, what's an outsider going to think when he sees you guys going, "Arr," to each other? He's going to think you're crazy.
Yeah.
He's not going to know anything about that Thanksgiving dinner. So you are a higher context society to that outsider. Okay? You see how this works now?
Yes.